Hi, everyone. Welcome to all of the team that's here. We have Dinesh, Luke, Mick, and Joss. We all work at Thinkmill, and we were having a discussion the other day just talking about design systems in general and some things about components and some newer stuff coming through with CSS as part of the design system. So we just wanted to have a little walkthrough of some best practices around CSS logical properties and some implementations of those for design systems. This sort of came from a discussion that Luke started about a team that he's working on at the minute and some of the constraints they have for their new design system. So Luke, do you want to give us a little bit of background context on that?
Yeah, sure. So the team that I'm working with to help build a design system, they have to support internationalization. So obviously part of that is handling right to left support and things like that. And so one of the things to consider with doing that is not only having like a language provider to sort of switch out all the text, but also making sure that the designs will naturally switch over to a right to left layout, like automatically as much as possible. So we're hoping to lean on using CSS custom properties to make that a lot easier. And so, yeah, we started a conversation around, best practices around that and things to look out for. So, yeah, that's where this conversation started.
Just for people who are new to this, because I had never heard of it before this conversation, but could you give us a rundown of like what the logical property would do, and sort of what kind of context we're getting into for that kind of stuff?
Yeah, sure. So CSS and HTML and all those languages that we use to build websites are predominantly created by English-speaking people. And so naturally, all the properties that we use kind of make some assumptions about people being using English. So obviously, in English, we write from left to right. But if I was to use padding or margin, things like that, on the left side, for instance, you kind of want that to switch to the right side most of the time for users who are using a right to left language. And so CSS logical properties are just like an abstract, a more abstract term, basically, so that you're not defining left and right, but more the placement of where your text starts. So you've got block, which is you can think of as left, top and bottom, although it gets a bit funky because there's vertical writing modes and stuff like that. And then there's inline, which is the equivalent of left and right. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So
Similar to the main axis and the cross axis, in a flex context.
okay. So it's sort of the flex implementation of doing things for text related stuff, of being able to move that around on that kind of container way. I actually did read into this, and there was a fantastic article from Ollie Williams on CSS tricks, which there'll be a link somewhere for, but it was a really, really good example of explaining those kind of things. And I'd never heard of the writing mode CSS property for vertical and horizontal stuff. Joss, you have horrendously large experience with design system stuff. So if you were building a brand new design system today, would in our previous conversations, we've talked about stuff like building in just using logical properties out the box and having them, or do we want to leave, padding left, padding right, those kind of sort of natural thought process ones that we've got as muscle memory in, and then how do we handle that under the hood, or what would your movements be in that sense?
I would probably go with logical properties out of the box, similar to introducing responsive design after the fact. It's much easier to just build it in, and if you need it later, you're ready to go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Same with accessibility, I think, as well. Of like, if you just start it from a good point, it's easier to get better rather than start from way behind.
So in the context of a design system, sorry, just to take over.
Absolutely.
So talking about using those logical properties from the start, there's probably going to be some edge cases where you actually need to use left and right for like just weird little one-off things here and there. Would you think it's useful to add those as props available as a primitive for styling usage from the start, or because they are kind of one-off things, it's okay to style them as one-off things and sort of not bake that into the design system and make it easier for people to know that they want inline start and inline end for left and right, once they get that in their head, that's all they need to know?
I think there's a lot of variables there. Like it depends on the maturity of the design system and the experience of those consuming the design system. Generally try and make it really easy to do the right thing and possible to do the wrong thing. So I'll probably omit physical properties, at least from the Blessed API. Like you'd always have escape hatches anyway, so they could apply those styles with a class name or an actual style prop should they need to. And even until you find a case, like you might not have a case for physical properties until like a year into the project. And you're like, oh, here it's actually appropriate. We want to be.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So, as with all sort of design systems, that level of education and documentation is sort of a big part of sort of guiding people in the right way. In terms of the, I like the phrase unblessed API sort of things, how would you build that into a system that, say, might be growing rapidly, or sort of as it matures, having the ability to say, I'm not going to get in the way of you building something and moving really quickly, but I also know you're going to try and find workarounds if you need it. Like if a design comes in, it's just like, no, this is it. I need to fit that in. What kind of like things can you lean on for that kind of stuff to be constrained but not in the way of progress?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, we just can't keep up with the requirements of product. Designers are always going to be beating you to, well, they're designing the things for implementing. So probably, escape hatches like we talked about, with some sort of syntax or mechanism to describe intent.
Okay.
Often like some prefix. We use unsafe class name, unsafe style. That is a little bit of a prompt for the person consuming that, a bit like React's dangerously insert in your HTML. Yeah. It tells you what you're doing is maybe not the right way to go about that, but also it's accurate in that, if the underlying markup for that component changes, like your class names won't work the way that you think they might. So it is unsafe. Yeah.
I suppose that would make debugging easier as well. If you're looking at a component that all of a sudden has some weird padding or some weird background color or something weird in it, being able to just do a find of, is anyone using unsafe class or unsafe style anywhere? Oh, there we go. That sort of debugging experience of a strange outlier.
Yeah, good first place to look.
Moving into, a newer team that's sort of never worked with a design system, never sort of thought about building one in terms of how we would design for a design system or reusing those components. Where would we start with, do we make it really narrow at the start until the sort of team builds their confidence and builds their knowledge base out? Or do we sort of leave it loose so there's the interpretation and sort of funnel it down as we mature?
Okay, so like faithful to the brand and the design language without being prohibitive or restrictive. Yeah, tricky, really tricky.
Yeah.
It depends a lot on the brand and on the product. I think there's a bit of a difference between like preventing exploration and conformity that has unfortunately gotten sort of tacked on to design systems. There's a little bit of that, but you shouldn't be getting in the way of people building new experiences and creating new things. So I guess just knowing your audience and your consumers and where to put those escape hatches. And
I suppose I also heard you talk previously about allowing those controls to sort of scale depending on sort of the hierarchy of where that sits. So something that sits really high up, like we don't want to have anything that flows down and trickles into other things. Yeah.
Customization, I guess, should sort of scale with the scope of your componentry. So really low level stuff should be almost infinitely customizable, right? Within your brand, you're still going to access tokens and that sort of thing. And then when you get up really high, maybe like a table view or I don't know, like an app shell or something, that's very limited in configuration.
Yeah, cool.
This also one of the challenging problems in the design system space. You got to start lean, but you can't be too lean, because design systems is one of those things where it's easier to spend more time, build constraints now to be flexible for the future, than not having things in place, and in the future retroactively making things across your product is super challenging. It takes a lot of time, effort, not just from the person who's building it, but from the entire team, all your designers, all your developers. So we got to start lean with enough constraints in place. But yeah, we can't be too lean when we're starting with design system. It's just one of those things, we got to be careful and be prepared to allow changes to get into the system without breaking the system.
So I suppose with that, there's sort of the leanness, but also there would be a priority of things that are going to be very important to a design system that we'll use a lot of, that we kind of want to have the most sort of looked at components for example, a button or something like that, where they're going to be used everywhere, and whatever you do with a button, it's probably going to be important. So what kind of if you were starting today and you've got your first 5 components that you were looking at building for a design system, is there sort of a set that is that's a no-brainer if you just build them first and then look at everything else? Or is it very much depends on the brand and what you're sort of building? That's open to everyone, because I know you're all working on very different projects at the minute.
Has anyone built a design system and not started with the button first? I'm curious.
I think it's before the button starts. It starts with the tokens. So all the conversations and figuring out a rough framework for your tokens. You definitely won't get your tokens right in the first try. So you figure out if your tokens are working in your button component. But before that, you have a rough idea of how your tokens might look. And then probably I've always started with a button.
And then you just build a button. Okay. And Luke, in terms of the project you're on, you're working with quite a large team at the minute. How do you sort of start with, where do we begin of a team that's really large, and we've got to build our button, but we also need that to be picked up and used and sort of spread through the system of, documentation and education. How much do we take of time of building it, but also sort of showing it off and sort of getting the buy-in of that kind of stuff?
It's super tricky. Buy-in is really, really hard. You can, work really closely with the designers and show stuff off in Slack or wherever, and people will say that they love it, looks great. But then when it comes to actually getting them to implement it, it's like pulling teeth sometimes.
Yeah, okay.
You've really got to dangle that carrot of showing them the DX wins to make it worth it.
Do you find it's tough to get them to implement just because of habit of, well, I've already got this one and I can just bring it across, or not sort of thinking in that thing of oh, we have a button, we have components for that kind of stuff? Where does that challenge stem from a lot of the time?
I think inertia plays a big role. Let's just keep doing what we're already doing.
Yep.
But there is the whole, it's not just a button component, it's a whole design system. I feel like I need to learn all of this and how it all works and what I can and what I can't do. So I think it can be a little bit intimidating for folks.
Yeah. I think the best feedback I've had from sort of working on design system components is if somebody messages me and they're like, hey, I put it in, and it's oh, you didn't tell me that you used that, so that must mean it was built pretty good because you didn't have to ask me how to do X, Y, or Z. It's yay.
Definitely. It's always a good feeling.
And then you've just got to write docs, just write more docs, right? Always docs.
Yeah. Or I think it's really helpful for the design system team to pair with teams to implement it to begin with. It's a really good dog fooding experience too, because there's going to be edge cases that we haven't considered because we might not necessarily know the nitty-gritty of what the people building the apps are coming up against, rather than we're off in design system land in these perfect little bubble. There's always little edge cases we haven't thought about.
So from a large team perspective, would you ideally bring on, as you sort of bring in one team and just specifically work one-on-one with that team? Or would you sort of, divide and conquer of, if there's 5 design system teams, we'll go to 5 different teams and then sort of generate feedback and come back?
Probably one at a time.
Okay.
Yeah, there's only so much you can do at once. Yeah, and even if it's just as simple as having like a little demo app that lives in the design system repo of like a mock version of some settings screens or something like that already exists, just to keep you in check of like, can I actually build the UIs that this is designed for with the components that we've built? And that's a really great thing to hand over to them and say, look, here, it's already like set up, all the layout's done, it's beautiful. You just need to wire it up. And so you've saved them a ton of time, a lot of time by doing that.
I think that is,
that.
yeah, I think that's always a big benefit, and something, you know, we've tried to do of build in the components of here's the buttons and here's the avatar and here's the stack of that thing, and then here's the top nav of a screen that what it would look like with, you know, 9 of these things in it, and it's pretty straightforward to sort of dig into.
Composition is huge. Like if your consumers are hitting issues before you recognize them, like that's a massive problem, and it'll really hurt adoption.
Yeah. I suppose as well, the design system, like a thing that sort of develops over time is that components that exist that are, you know, sort of strictly consumed like a button or an avatar where you're just sort of feeding it things and that's what it does, versus that compositional, you know, your box component or your stack or that kind of thing. You know, do they live theoretically, do they come in at the same time, or is it more of components first, then composition style things later?
It could be a combination, right? Like a lot of components are compositional. You think of like a tabs component or something like that, you know. A lot of these you need to place together. So again, that's where it's really helpful to be able to pair with teams and sort of show them how to adopt them. Because that compositional story might be something that might be maybe new to them, or they're coming at from a different angle.
And it's not really waterfall-y either. You keep building stuff and you keep learning how they can reuse bits and pieces. So your combo box got built first, and then you realize that your drop down can reuse a bunch of those like item styles or item behaviors or pressed states and all that.
I have an abstract question for you guys. As one of the least tech fluent or design system fluent of our group here, I loved seeing the traction that this conversation got in Slack, but could you give me the explanation that's not so much about the technical stuff, but more about the process of the discussion you had, if I were your grandmother, on why was this cool? Like, why do people care about this conversation? What was interesting here? And that can be to anyone.
I'll take a shot of that from a low level sort of entry point. I think conversations around design system internally at Thinkmill are always fun because, you know, we've done a lot of them, and a lot of them that are sort of pretty large and small in scale. Like we've done the gamut, and a lot of thoughts come out of building those and sort of improving those and getting them better. And I think there's a lot of, you know, the interest that flows around because the benefits from sort of implementing a good design system for a company, for a business, for those kind of teams to help them move really quick and sort of expand and sort of keep up, you know, with a product that sort of is, you know, might be changing a lot or might just sort of need some consistency, or, you know, I think having that windfall of giving back to that team and sort of empowering that team of making them, you know, really, really efficient in being able to move, is always a great thing to see, of people enjoying your design system and sort of moving and building stuff really quick. Sort of helps everyone all the way through the companies and the businesses.
My take on it is the idea of design system is not about what you can build or what you've built. It's always about learning the approaches and process and iterating from past experience. So this, especially this conversation around padding left, padding right versus padding start, padding end. Now I've learned how to approach padding or spacing tokens from this conversation. So going forward, any design system I'm building, I would naturally, instead of opting in for padding start and end, I know why that's not right way to go about it. I know why, you know, I should think in terms of start and end instead of left and right. This is a big takeaway. So now one more solid constraint has been baked into my mind when I'm thinking about design systems. That's how I see this conversation help me.
Absolutely. I think that happens a lot. Like, in the last sort of couple of days of launching our Thinkmill website, thinkmill.com.au for anyone out there. If this is audio only, the feedback that we got from the team of so many things that came into that list of saying like, oh, we just need to have a look at this or that. And it was like, I didn't know that was a thing. Now I do. And now I will always know. And now that will never catch me off guard again, because that's now, and yeah, exactly that. You've raised that base level of what you know for that kind of thing. And I think that's a huge thing that all these massive threads that we have, things that you just flick through them and you're like, oh, I'm filing that away. That's going away. I'll pull that out later. That'll be good.
It's so great. All these conversations at Thinkmill. So the way I look at it, you learn from experience, yeah. And I'm learning more from these conversations than experience. I get to learn from everyone's experience just by talking about it. It's pretty great if you think about it.
So you always leave those sorts of conversations richer. Like either they're doing something a different way and you can learn from that, and it's specific for their scenario but not for yours, maybe, and that's valuable information, or you're approaching it in a really similar way, and that mutual convergence is sort of validation that both approaches are probably the right way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the openness of collaboration stuff, like Dinesh and I were talking previously about, we just rebuilt the site in Astro, and he's got a couple of projects going on Astro. So we were just going to compare notes of things we found to sort of like put together a bit of a thing of like, oh, these are sort of common things that we found that are just little quick wins that you can have and use. And I think in context of like why this conversation is sort of happening and being recorded, it is that because these threads and these conversations happen so often that are super helpful, not just for us, like they'd be helpful for so many people. And it comes in from other teams we work with, like, oh, well, that was a good thing that came in, and that sort of filters back into conversations that happen around that kind of stuff, which moves things forward as well, which is always great.
That's the best part. The conversation that stemmed in was from Luke working on his project, and I'm working on other Keystone things. But now I learned from Luke's experience and the conversation that carried forward. I like to call it diversity of experience.
I guess we've diverged a little bit from the original logical properties conversation. It's more about design systems in general, which is fine. One little thread that I think we didn't pull on a lot is logical properties kind of don't give it you like vertical writing mode for free. Well, you can't, like, the designs need to change. So that's something to be considerate of when designing APIs and whatnot. So I'd noticed that something Joss was working on where he's actually picked the margin inline start and inline end, but is using top and bottom to sort of lock that in. And it's interesting. I'm kind of got mixed feelings about it. It's like, it feels a bit weird to sort of mix properties, but it kind of does signal that it is for left and right to left only. And it also lets you be a little bit more less verbose about sort of saying margin start instead of margin inline start. So you can, it's just a bit shorter, a bit more terse, which I don't know. There's kind of two ways to think about it. It's like, oh, it's kind of deviating from CSS, and so you need to learn the design system way of doing things a little bit. Whereas you go the other way around, it's like, oh, I already know the CSS. I know how the design system works. But yeah, not really a question, but I just thought that would be something to sort of talk about a little bit more and sort of pull that thread a bit.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you were building a component library outside of a design language, then you would be much closer to the spec, I guess. Like, design system is just a collection of opinions. Where are you going to draw those lines that says, this is ours and this is how we do things? Yeah, and we'll see if it's the right decision long term. Yeah, right now it's working.
But is that the kind of thing of, I guess, the kind of the same way you've got to think about a whole bunch of different things of like, there's varying levels of support, right? Like, you can have accessibility support for a screen reader, but you can have horrible contrast for someone with sort of low contrast vision and stuff like that. So there's sort of, you've got to think of both in that way. So that sort of supporting of left to right to left text is one stage, but then the next step would be, we're going to do some design and do a bit of a refactor to sort of support vertical as well as that, to sort of take that next step forward.
That's right. Transform, rotate 90 degrees. Done.
Yeah. Love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah, I don't know, you're just doing the best with what information you have available at the time.
I suppose these are also like these kind of decisions are also big business case ones of like, do we have a market that is predominantly right to left reading, or, you know, do we have a predominantly vertical, you know, we have Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or Mongolian or something like that, that sort of is, we definitely need that as a use case. So therefore we need to bake that into to a business decision of why we're going to sort of put the time in for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me think I should probably change my original answer. Like, if you're never going to support RTL or any other, you know, writing mode, don't bother, you know?
Yeah.
Physical properties are fine. Don't increase cognitive overhead if you don't have to.
Yeah, so yeah, I think it massively comes down to understanding the system and foresight. Yeah. For example, if you're building a system for a banking website within Australia, you know your users, so you could limit your constraints to your user base. You don't have to think about all the things that you would usually build for your international users. On the other hand, if you're building a system for your blog website, that's going, you know, it's going to be international, so you can design your constraints based on that. It comes down to foresight, trying to not think everything up ahead. At the same time, trying to not think everything up is also a challenging problem. We got to pick our battles, and we got to pick our complexity and flexibility layout to be lean as possible, with enough space to improve in the future.
Yeah, I guess the argument for just grabbing logical properties out the box would be, if you ever wanted to, you wouldn't have to go backwards and sort of redo a big thing that would be quite difficult for a find replace, or, you know, just tedious.
I think those sorts of changes scare me the most, when find replace will get many cases but be wrong in a lot of cases. Yeah.
You kind of need the I need to find replace, but I also need the context of where and why.
You have to check every one of them anyway.
Yeah.
It is not just the code. So when we start thinking in terms of start and end, we are going to onboard designers to think in the same way. So the designs that come out, they'll be using the same tokens. They'll be thinking the designs in terms of start and end. Now, if we decide to change it, it's not just changing the code. We got to re-onboard designers. We got to retune their thinking process to think in terms of the new tokens. So these are one of those super costly changes to go at a later point, which will take a lot of time and effort.
It's a really good point. Yeah. It's not just a development concern, for sure.
Yeah, big time. Yeah. Awesome. I don't think if anyone has anything else, Mick, Luke, Dinesh, Joss.
A practical takeaway for someone new to this, something really easy as a thing to keep in mind that you should take on board before approaching this.
I don't know, maybe just keep your eye on emerging technologies, like be aware of, you know, new CSS properties. It can be really hard to learn that stuff, as you know, if you're thrown into a project that has them. It's nice to know what the heck's going on.
I suppose a lot of that stuff is keeping an eye on it, but not necessarily having to deep dive on it, unless there's sort of like the practical application of like, this is a good thing to learn because it's the next iteration, or sort of moving forward of like padding left, padding right, of thinking about it in that way of sort of like, oh, if I just go with, you know, logical, it sort of fixes me for the most part across the board in that way, which is a great of having it. Of that's an improvement that is just now a built-in one of like, I would just use logical instead of that for the most part.
Yeah, I forgot the caveat, which is if you have to support Internet Explorer or not.
Just don't. Just don't.
Yeah.
Just don't. Simple fix.
Friends don't let friends support Internet Explorer.
Yeah. That's a different video. That's a longer, much rantier video.
Polyfill your way out of that problem.
Yeah. Well, we are ranting. I do wish they hadn't picked start and end for both margin and inline. It just makes it really confusing to try to differentiate between the two of them sometimes, especially the border radius stuff you were talking about, Joss, but just in general.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a quite a long thread from Joss in our Slack channel that was a very interesting take on. It's a very illogical choice for what they chose for border radiuses, right?
Oh, it just without the prefix, right? So margin, inline, start, you're like, I know where that's going. But border, start radius, you know, it takes a moment to go, oh, they want block and then inline.
Yeah.
And I guess like all this stuff, you know, you use it enough and it just becomes second nature.
Yeah. I would actually like to go back again for a little contextual piece of the difference a design system versus, say, a component library, and sort of, is it just an evolution? Is a component system just sort of the early days of a total design system, or is like, what is the graduation process, or is there one?
I think it's just a component library you can charge more for, isn't it?
All right. Well, if there's a brand, if there's
Okay.
a design language behind it,
Yeah.
if there's motive and intent, and there's opinions around how things should be done, I guess it's pretty gray.
Yep.
But that's how I would probably categorize it. Things like material and chakra, they have an aesthetic out of the box, but you're expected to change that. Yeah.
So it's more of a baseline of that kind of stuff. Yeah, cool. Because I know we worked on a project with a company that owned multiple brands, and it was sort of bringing that into line up of, they all start to look consistent, of like, oh, cool, they're in the same umbrella, even though they have different branding, different styles, different typography, that kind of stuff. So it's the overall sort of look and feel would be that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you start talking about things, cross-platform, and it's not just your button radius, it's your writing style, and your audio and animation and duration, and all sorts of things that tie the brand together across platforms and products.
I suppose if we're talking in design terms, this would be the design system would be the brand book of developing.
Yep. Well, let me give you an example here. Tom, you recently got married.
Yep.
You hired someone to stitch a custom suit for you.
Yep.
Because no suit in the store will stitch perfectly for you.
It's got nothing to do with my body shape, but that was a custom choice. Like, just before.
Yeah, what I'm saying is, store-bought suits are common for everyone, but if you hire someone to stitch a personal suit, it's going to suit you the best. So that's what Zen system is. It's fine-tuned to serve a purpose within a brand.
Yeah.
But in a component libraries, it can be open sourced. Anyone can use it easily.
Great analogy. Do you want it off the rack, or do you want it tailored? I love that. Cool. We might wrap it up there. Thank you again very much for Joss, Luke, Dinesh, and Mick for joining us. This is something new for us, so we are trying this out. So if we have any sort of feedback or opinions that you liked, love to hear them. And we're hoping to do a few more of these and sort of grow on them. But this is just us trying something new out to try and get a bit more information and a bit more things, that sort of the great stuff that we capture out there to everyone else. So thank you for joining us.
Cheers. Have a good one.
See ya.